Thank you so much, Mike, and thank you, panelists, for that enriching discussion. I feel like we could be discussing this for the next decade, as I mentioned, and I think we will be. So let's keep the communication lines open. I am excited to introduce our last panel for the day, which is going to be moderated by Rachel Brown, who is the founder and president CEO of Project Over Zero. We shared a report that they did recently with the New American Foundation, which was also featured in the post. We've dropped that in the chat. So Rachel, if you maybe want to say a couple minutes about that before you introduce your panel on advocacy, community, and society, bridging conflict, resolution, and mediation. What does that look like, and how can we collectively be a part of the answer?
Thank you so much, Summer, and thank you to everyone who organized this wonderful event. I think it's such an important set of conversations to be having and to consider it as a midpoint. I know these conversations have been going on for a long time, and this is certainly also not the last. So I hope this helps catalyze more conversations, and I'm just really excited to be able to moderate a fantastic panel with amazing speakers. So I will say a quick note. Summer mentioned a paper that went into the chat earlier and asked me to speak about it. This is a paper co-authored actually with Heather Hurlbert, who you heard from earlier today from New America, that focuses, it was written actually towards the end of 2019 with a focus towards what are the different types of tactics and approaches necessary to create resilience to political violence in the US. And the work that we've done at Over Zero in the last year has worked to operationalize that and turn it into practice, especially during this last election cycle with the whole toolkit on developing community resilience. So I think that is really enough about me, because I'm so excited to jump into this panel. We are talking about community, about society. We have experts on this panel from mediation, peace building, working online and offline, and everything from negotiations to narrative change. And so I won't be able to do justice to their bios, but let me at least give it a shot at the beginning. We have with us Nealin Parker. Nealin is the founder and co-director of the Bridging Divides Initiative. They're at Princeton University and really work to support local community resilience in the United States by building on expertise from political violence prevention and elections work around the world. Nealin is also a lecturer at Princeton University's School of Public and International Affairs and has a joint appointment at the Liechtenstein Institute on Self-Determination, among so much additional experience, and we'll get to hear from her soon. Shamil Idriss is the Chief Executive Officer, the CEO of Search for Common Ground, which is the world's largest dedicated peace-building organization. In his current capacity as CEO and in his previous capacities as the President, Chief Operating Officer, and Burundi Country Director, Shamil has led Search's efforts to end violent conflict in more than 35 countries globally, including some of the most devastating conflict zones in the Middle East and in Africa. Sabeen Malik is a senior policy advisor with Google. She has spent her education and career pursuits on becoming a leader on law and economic development issues, innovation economies, tech policy, and next generation economic trends. She's worked as a senior advisor at the US Department of State. She's an Aspen Socrates Fellow, a member of the German Marshall Young Transatlantic Network, and a former board member of the Georgetown University Law Center International Arbitration Society. So just a fantastic panel today. There is so much to talk about. So we're going to dive in and do our best to save some time at the end for Q&A. So if you have questions as we go, please place them in the chat. So we're going to start with Nealin and dive into exploring what we know about some of the trends in tensions and in political violence here in the US, about immediate needs and the ecosystem that exists to address them, and what it looks like to bring that forward into the future. So Nealin, with Bridging Divides Initiative, you've really been tracking trends both in collaboration and bridge building, but also in violence and in tension over the past months. And so as you consider hand in hand both the challenges that we face and the ecosystem that exists to address them, I would love to start off by asking you to speak for a moment about both where you see hotspots and needs in the immediate term, and how you see that interacting with more medium and long-term needs.
Yeah, this is a great question. I'm very aware of the fact that we are the last panel of the day, so I would like to thank everybody who has hung in here this far, and also the panel right before that I just got to hear was fantastic. So it's a little hard to follow, but I want to, but I'm staying away from slides for that purpose, and let me give, I think, just a top line that is important for us to keep in mind about what just happened with this election. So starting in the pre-electoral period, over the course of this whole year, we've had a lot of political mobilization, and some of it was focused on the election, and some of it was focused on sort of policy and other issues. A huge amount of activity happening in early summer around racial justice, and then some spikes related to COVID and the pandemic there. In that entire period, the vast majority of what was happening was peaceful. So not only was the experience of most Americans around the election a peaceful experience, but the mobilization, the highly interested people for the vast majority of America were doing that, expressing that in a peaceful way. And I think that's a really important piece to keep in mind, but I also think it's not the whole story. Sitting on top of this, and I think the reason that we have this the summer's efforts here and all of us here right now is because we know that there are concerning trends. There are the kind of concerning trends like effective polarization, like mis and disinformation, like political leaders not only standing in a sort of concerning place on some of the violent actors, but in some ways really supporting them. We know that there's decreased trust in the governance in this country, and that affects the elections as well. So with all of those pieces together, what you have is a circumstance where there is higher risk for violence, and that didn't change with this election. So one of the things that this election was the moment that we descended into civil war. And a few weeks ago, there were real concerns that there would be mass militia showing up at all of the polling sites. We didn't see that. But nor did we see that this election was a turning point where now we can kind of rest easy. And all of those broader arc issues, racial tensions and the justice system and the democratic system, all of those strains still exist now. So I think with that broader context, we also find ourselves in the continued election of 2020, and will stay there, I think, through the peaceful transition of power. That means that we are, for that reason, also still in a little bit of an acute moment. What we've been seeing in mobilization kind of from here forward, I think, is the scenario that of a Trump win, despite the fact that there are competing narratives about who has won the election. The mobilization has been, by and large, on the right side of the spectrum. And I think in terms of the patterns to kind of be aware of and be concerned about, there is increased militia activity, and there is increased militia coordination. If this election has some of the trends of the last election, there is the potential of increased targeted violence, particularly against Black and Brown people and Jewish and Muslim people and other communities that have been targeted in the past. There's the potential for police violence as well, and some of this can be around protests, but that is something that I think that we have talked about in other places in the summit, but is something that's very important. And finally, there is the potential for increased violence around protests and counter-protests.
So Nealin, building on what you see here in terms of the trends around risk, I'm wondering if you could spend just a couple of minutes, given your work mapping alongside this mapping of risk, the ecosystem that exists for resilience, for response, for depolarizing, and for addressing some of the harms that we see. If you could talk about a couple of areas that you see as particularly promising, what it looks like for them to move into the future, and especially, given that we have a lot of people on this call that are passionate about this, areas that you see to plug in and support or engage with.
Yeah, let me lay out just very quickly. I think of it as a little bit of now and later. So the ecosystem right now, what you can do is prevent immediate violence. You can mitigate existing violence. You can kind of create the space for later. And later, what you need in this same system is dealing with truth and justice, democracy, intergenerational or multi-generational reconciliation efforts, the sort of like deep and hard and good work that has to happen. What's happening in the immediate is just trying to prevent the violence that would have the bottom drop out of that. And this whole ecosystem is necessary. You really can't do the later without the now, but the now is not enough. You have to make sure that it's leading into the later. So the work now on sort of early warning and response, like the trust network, or crisis mediation, de-escalation with police, the work that you did at Over Zero with planning with local leaders, all of these things are now, in crisis comms, all those things are really important right now. And they need to connect with addressing the inequities in the United States, the racial injustice, the problems with the justice system and governance in general, addressing lower trust in the election systems, all of those pieces, as well as this, as I said, the reconciliation. All of that is a kind of longer term effort. And I got really jazzed about trying to understand what was out there. And so I think Mary may drop into the chat a link that I would encourage everybody to look at, which tries to get the breadth of the now and the later. And on the one hand, have organizations, and there are over 5,000 across the country that are in this mapping, that do things from addressing the long-term inequalities to trying to prevent immediate violence and interrupt that in the short term.
Thank you, Nealin. So we will turn now to Shamil and take time to dive really into the learnings from Search's work over several decades, and really dive into learnings about what it takes to make a sustained impact in communities, and then what it looks like to take that type of impact to scale and to sustain it over time. So Shamil, if we can start off with this question, if you could just think about, in your work around the world, testing and learning from different approaches. I know we talked about this a little bit in our preparation, but if you could start by talking a little bit about what we know works, and what are some of the qualities of the types of interventions that we know works. What does it really take to have a transformative impact on communities?
Great. Thanks, Rachel, very much. And thank you all for having me. I really regret that I couldn't participate earlier in the day. I know a number of the speakers and really respect them, and the ones I don't know, I wanted to hear from, but I've got a board meeting tomorrow and I've been preparing for it. I think a couple of insights that I would draw from the work that our teams in about 30 countries around the world have done over the last nearly 40 years. The first is related to this, what I would call a false dichotomy between peace and justice. I don't think you can really advance either without the other. It's oftentimes understood and stated that you can't have peace without justice, but the reverse is also true. And particularly when you think about peace as positive peace, not just the absence of violence, but the presence of the conditions that enable societies to deal with their conflicts constructively. And when you think about justice as more than just punitive or retributive justice, and you think about it as harmony, and you think about it as restorative justice. So when you think about justice and peace in these broader terms, they're really two sides of the same coin, and you can't really advance without the one without the other. Having said that, the issues that people are divided around, many of them are very real, they're urgent, they affect people's livelihoods, in some cases their rights, in some cases even their lives. The issues, some of them are also systemic, and they're embedded in decades of long unaddressed grievances or inequities. And increasingly they're framed and understood as identity-based, even if they didn't start that way, or whether or not they started that way, they've taken on that character. I mean, we just had a presidential election in which one party didn't even put forward a policy platform. It was largely about identity and culture, explicitly said or implicitly understood. And so those are all some of the challenges about how you kind of work through this peace justice thing together as you're dealing with issues that are that complex and challenging. In terms of lessons, some things that that are, I think, pretty well understood across the field, not just in our organization, that you don't do, and then what we would say we've seen work. You don't force, manipulate, or in any way try to pressure people who have been victimized or are currently being victimized or view themselves as being victimized, even if you don't particularly think they are being, to empathize with, quote unquote, the other. That's a surefire way to backfire and can cause more harm than good. Clearly, you don't jump in and out of situations. There's no quick fix. Trust is sort of the fundamental building block of both building peace and justice, whether it's trust between communities or trust between a community and the police force or the government, whatever it might be. And trust is really easy to destroy. It can be destroyed very quickly. It always takes a while to build up. And third, and one of the challenges that oftentimes real transformation happens at the local level where people live, where their kids go to school, where they make their livelihoods, where they have some commitment and investment. And yet it needs oftentimes to have a nationwide and sometimes even a broader regional impact. So how do you deal with that dichotomy between needing locally led efforts and local transformation to somehow have a much broader application? In terms of what we've learned, no matter how broad and systemic the issues are, all change does start with people. That might sound very simplistic, but it does start with people. There's an desire oftentimes to jump to the national level, jump to the systems attack. And in some ways, the hardest and least effective place to jump to is the national level issues. In terms of how sides can be brought together and you can maximize the chances for transformation towards peace and justice. The field continues to be relatively dominated by a sort of fragility assessment approach where people look at everything that's going wrong and try to identify the biggest problems. For people who have studied the field of appreciative inquiry, our experience, at least, is that a more of an appreciative inquiry approach is much more effective. We try to take that hopeful perspective from throughout our engagement in any community, and being hopeful and being naive are two very different things. So I had first come across the term appreciative inquiry in a Harvard Business Review article that had nothing to do with justice, peace, and conflict. It was about how you change the culture in your company. And it was the first time I had learned about appreciative inquiry, and it was one of the best articulations of what I had seen our teams around the world doing very effectively, which is an understanding that oftentimes the worst way to change behavior is to punish bad behavior. Doesn't mean that punishment is never wrong, but the most effective way to change behavior is to celebrate, incentivize, amplify every step towards the desired behavior, no matter how incremental that step might be, right? And so, and I see that as a parent. If I yell at my daughter, for the 15th time for not putting her shoes in the bin I got for that specific purpose, she's much less likely to do it than if I celebrate her like crazy because she put one shoe in today. She's much more likely to put two in tomorrow. And apply that to engaging in conflict settings, looking for whether it's the positive deviancy where communities are holding together or where that trust exists, even if it's breaking down all around, is one place to look. Asking a different set of questions. If people are divided across racial or political lines, asking, is there anybody across these divides who you trust, with whom you have a positive relationship? Is there anyone in this corrupt government that is actually trying to serve the people? Is there anyone in this police force that is going to war with the community that actually has good relationships with the community, and vice versa? And what we found is 100% of the time, if you ask those questions, you get many, many answers. And it's the people and the individuals who come out of that kind of an assessment process, that kind of appreciative inquiry assessment process, that we gravitate towards, we seek to partner with and to support. If you take a problem-based lens or a fragility assessment lens, even when you come across those people, you tend to dismiss them. And that's why those lenses are oftentimes a recipe for cynicism and hopelessness. Even if you come across the one police captain who's got this positive relationship, you think, well, that's great, but he's one person in a huge police force that's out of control. What difference can he make? The second lesson from us after that kind of appreciative inquiry lens is the importance not just of dialogue, but of action. In describing our methodology once shortly after Nelson Mandela was released in South Africa, a commandant from the Spear of the Nation, which was the militant wing of the African National Congress, interrupted our person and said, I understand what you're saying. You're saying we should understand the differences, but act on the commonalities. And we probably owe that person royalties for how many times we essentially took that as our motto. Understanding differences is very important. You don't paper over the differences, you don't ignore them, you don't pretend that they're minimal, but understanding them clearly so they don't overwhelm everything in the relationship is the first step to then being able to identify where there might be some areas of commonality. And again, the more local you get and the more you get with people who actually live, send their kids to school, make their livelihoods in the same places, the more you'll identify multiple areas of commonality that can be the starting point for cooperation. And that cooperative action is really the critical element in our experience to building trust, much more so than simply dialogue, getting people to do anything. You might have even seen, I know it's trite, but people might have seen the Heineken ad, Worlds Apart. If you haven't, you should watch it. It's one of the better sort of 4-minute clips of how you do transformative work. And they start by getting people to actually build something, an IKEA furniture thing together before they even get into any issues. The last thing that I would share as lesson learned is if you want to make the leap between individual or interpersonal transformation and much more systemic change, in our experience, there are 3 forms that takes. You either are able to change institutions, the police force adopts a community policing approach, or a network of radio stations decides to cover issues in a certain way so as to not inflame violence. Or you change norms, meaning culture, the way a critical mass of the population deals with and talks about its differences, or you give rise to local markets where there's actually funding, there's a resource base for an ongoing application of what we might call a peace building approach. Institutions, norms, and markets, each of those levels of change, if you can achieve that level of change, then you can trigger what sustainable scale. And scaling up is really critical, but scaling up without sustainability doesn't work. And unfortunately, philanthropy does not support sustainable scale almost ever. And so achieving that level of change in our experience takes at least 8 to 10 years, at least. Doesn't mean you can't generate results sooner than that. But if you're trying to actually shift institutions, shift social norms, or give rise to local markets that will support this kind of thing going forward, it takes at least that kind of time, which is why we don't make less than generation-long commitments to any place that we work.
Thank you so much, Shamil. And I think so much in there that's important to unpack. And really a piece of it is how critical it is to be rooted in the local and in people's own and engagement in their communities. But the challenge of figuring out how to take that to scale and just to pull out as well, I think that critical notion of diving into the places where things are working. And I think that ties so much into the notion of norms and the way that the things we understand about human behaviors and actions, how influenced we are by what we think most people are doing, or most people in our group or our community are doing. And so the importance of not just focusing on what's bad or what's going wrong, but making more visible, making it easier to join in to the things that are going right, and really building momentum around those things. So thank you so much for that. And before I dive into a little bit of conversation amongst the panel, I'm really excited to dive in with Sabeen a little bit, especially given I think what we've all seen and what's come out in this conversation throughout the day of the importance of the online ecosystem and how the interaction between online and offline polarization and division. And so we'll hear from Sabeen about some of the different ways leaders can engage with different platforms, different types of social media, and case studies of what it looks like. And Sabeen, your background is just so extensive in all of this, everything from diplomacy to your current focus in the online space. And again, with this tension between online and offline, I think given so many types of stakeholders at this event. We have everyone from grassroots leaders and business leaders to philanthropists. I know one of the things that you've thought a lot about is how leaders from different sectors can engage with social media platforms in different ways. Where are those entry points? What are some of those critical ways to make an impact? And I'm wondering if you could talk us through a little bit about what you see as some of the different types of promising strategies that exist for engagement that people might not be aware of or that might not be top of mind.
Yeah, so thank you, everybody. It's great to kind of hear so much of the great conversation that's gone on a really topical issue in the way that, online behavior is very much a reflection of offline behavior. I think one of the things that we've seen, and especially with this election in particular, is that, polarization just didn't happen because things just went online. These are trends that have existed and are amplified in many ways, but that amplification isn't because of the tech itself is amplifying something that's ugly. I think it's ugliness that gets amplified as we keep moving, because there are lots of spaces where folks are not getting to completion the frustrations that they have in the now, And then as we move into the later, which I love Nealin's kind of approach on this, which is the now tends to be reactive. So you see a lot of sort of this content moderation that happens, right? Take down, make the message, put some label on there, slap something on there, make it go away. But then there's nothing about in the long term, if I even go back as a historical record and look at the context, there's nothing for me to understand what happened. What was that decision? What was the longer term effect of how and why that happened? And, I think it's a little easy to say that, people will go and look at their bubbles. I mean, that happens, I think, but that's also just a reflection of people doing it in local spaces as well. I'll give you the example of Nextdoor, online platform. It really was meant to just build communities, like just to tell you, hey, is, a cop in the area? Is there some event happening? Something as basic as just what's happening in your community. Give me some examples of things that other people want to know. And it's like a quick, hey, neighbor, I hear a noise, tell me what's up. Or there's something happening in the school district. But that platform never thought about the question about what is it when offline behaviors start to become the node or the nexus by which people want to engage the platform for local influence. So really quickly around the election, half of the moderators asked, we're not equipped to deal with political conversation and political norms. How are we supposed to deal with this? We can't shut it down because people are having these conversations in the bakery, in the coffee shop, even hopefully they're masked or unmasked, but that we're sort of seeing this. And we need better tools that help us just to engage in these conversations the way you would offline. How do and why do we do that? Who gets to be chosen as a moderator? What are the roles and responsibilities that need to happen? So Nextdoor is, I think, a really good example of kind of a place where the intent of that platform was very different. It was just to be notifications. And it ended up becoming this very hot button, sort of what's happening in the now. And all you ended up doing was, rather than engage in the conversation, just being reactive. People were taking down messages. Folks were just shutting down sort of certain community boards. They were trying to push them into other places that were more engaged in terms of longer term conversation. But the longer term conversation, the tools we just don't have. As Nealin said, we have to kind of get into some of the really longer term institutional building conversations, even in the online spaces. And we're just not good at doing that. Something that, Shamil also talked about too, and that is, to give people who are trying to do this work online, people who are trying to moderate conversations in a way that's holistic, whether it's a good thread on Nextdoor in a local community, all the way to Twitter, there is really no incentive for doing that. It's just somebody being good. But we're not really sort of socializing this idea of actually having an online culture where folks are incentivized to sort of do that work. How do you understand differences but identify commonalities? How do you sort of take something that is very, very distinct in terms of a specific issue set? And you can't do that in certain forums. But the idea that these forums then become the way to do that, then you have to ask the other question, what other online tools can we create around those ecosystems to be able to then take that conversation and put it into a longer term discussion that is facilitated in a way that I think for those who've done this work, this is generational change. You're not going to be able to do that and facilitate that just because it's online. And so I think in some ways, this is the way that we need to sort of start to approach. I think philanthropy can do a really good job in terms of partnering with a lot of these companies in terms of thinking about, like, what are just some good strategies, moderation strategies? What are some ways in which you can start to teach maybe and incentivize a community within each of these online platforms to kind of play that role? Maybe even as, I mean, this sounds silly, but I think there's so much we can learn from gaming culture here in terms of incentivizing folks to be able to look at what are the communities they create and how do you create positive online reciprocity between those who are, doing good and doing bad. And I don't mean good and bad in sort of this, like, kind of, again, in terms of gaming, it's win or lose, but this idea of like kind of creating a place where folks feel safe. Folks feel like they can actually talk about what are the issues top of mind. In a place like Nextdoor, top of mind issues are about who you are as a person. You cannot take the election away from that online community board. It's top of mind for some people. It is about who they are, what their children are facing. Are they worried about putting signage in their door that may make them a target? But at the same time, folks who are just trying to make sure that, the tools of the board are being used properly, those are not the people that we can hold responsible. I think that's irresponsible in a way to kind of assume that that's just behavior that, without sort of building that repository, then we can sort of point to it and say, look, online is kind of this like just cesspool of difficult people, and we keep incentivizing all these difficult conversations. That doesn't mean, though, at the same token, that we don't have to take a very, very hard look at sort of what are the things that get the most noise and are incentivized online to kind of create these sort of moments where you are sort of looking at the lowest common denominator of content. And then that is what gets amplified and sort of the voices of folks that are actually doing the bridge building work. They really don't have a place where they can show those examples and they can sort of facilitate that. And then we have some examples where, again, like so much of the work is really local. Every time for online communities, what you see is a lot of the infrastructure that is needed on the ground level to even deal with sort of this online proliferation has to be at the local level. There needs to be both an offline and online component. And then you look at sort of these global platforms and everyone says, well, one size fits all, grab the bad content and take it off the platform right away. But we kind of need to see what the problems are. And in some communities, really, truly, this is the only way that they're able to discuss these issues. So what do you do in those circumstances? So I think there's a lot more discussion that needs to happen about what works in certain realms and what doesn't. But one thing that we have found consistently is that we need a local, stronger ecosystem. Whether it's dealing with issues in the now, so safety, security, all the way into the longer term about how do you actually just relate to individuals when you're having these discussions, and what are some of the ways in which you can incentivize good behavior to be able to do that.
Thank you so much, Sabeen. We have limited time left, and I just want to tease out and pull out a couple of themes that I think we've heard since we're the last panel, both throughout the day and on this panel. And I think something that's really sticking with me is just that there are no shortcuts. We didn't get here overnight, and we didn't get here to the place that we're all so concerned about without a lot of work to put us into this place. And we're not going to get to a different place overnight. We're not going to get there without a lot of work, without relationships, without the investment it takes to build trust, which has to be an investment that's over time and that's personal in many ways. We're not going to get there without relationships, as Sadia described, that help us collaborate across an ecosystem, and without being able to build relationships to new and different groups that reach across sectors. And so one of the things that came up in our preparation conversation for this panel was all the different tensions that need to be navigated in doing this work in a way that is rooted in community, but is scalable, in a way that addresses the immediate urgency of the now without compromising the need to do much more long-term sustained work into the future. The tension between addressing the things that are harmful and that we see where we see violence, where we see rhetoric that is harmful and dangerous, versus elevating and promoting the places where we see things going right. There are all these things to balance as we work through this. And one of the tensions that we all wanted to end in a conversation on, and that Shamil already began addressing, is this tension that often arises between ideas of peace and justice, but which I think many of us who've been in this field for a long time see them not just in tension with each other, but as critical to one another. And I think part of this connects to the idea of peace as a passive versus an active state addressing underlying issues. And I think something that's come up a lot in this conversation, and the one question I got in the chat, I think gets at this, is that in the US, the polarization we have is complicated, both in that it engages multiple facets of our identity, in that we face high levels of affective or emotional political polarization. We face these things alongside a legacy of systemic racism, of oppression, of marginalization and targeting of different groups. And it's happening alongside it right now. And I think we heard from Mary McCord this morning talking about how there's a need to connect across divides, but how can we also ensure that where there is rhetoric, where there is mobilization to specifically exclude or target different groups, that we're not engaging that in this framework of just one side of a debate, but that we're actually able to set strong norms against violence, against the promotion of violence. And so I really want to as we move forward, ask the panel, each panelist, to just reflect a little bit on what it looks like in the US to address polarization and bring people together while also addressing these long-term injustices, their manifestations and their legacies. And how do we hold these multiple things at once? And what are some of the questions that we need to be asking ourselves to ensure that we're able to hold them alongside each other, and wrestling with and checking in on as we do this work? And this ties, I will say, the question that I got into the chat from a participant was, how should the bridge building field ensure that we're not actually just promoting one side of the roughest set of divides that we're working on? So we're seeing people who are doing this work also facing different tensions. So I'm gonna turn it to the panel. Sabeen, I know you have the earliest hard stop, so I just want to start with you, and I guess we'll work backwards and land on Nealin, just to reflect on any of those tensions that came up in our conversations and throughout the day, of just things that you would want people to keep in mind and continue wrestling with as we do this work.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest one is this tension between really truly the now and the later. I think there's a real tension between wanting to just take things away and not seeing them and then not dealing with them. So in the online space, what does that mean? Just stop people from contributing, stop the content, just make sure that, we don't see it. Well, what happens? It goes to the darker and darker places where there's less and less conversation. And so what are we seeing now? We're sort of seeing folks continue to move to more and more unregulated spaces and places online. And whether that's the dark web or to places where the rules of community standards are really, really basic in terms of what they expect from users. These are the types of things where I think these are the corollary effects, but really deleterious effects of sort of saying, well, on the main platforms, it's okay, we have a certain set of standards, but then we don't want to deal with the darkest pieces of sort of the issues that fundamentally cause those rifts in the first place. And if we don't do that, we're just going to keep seeing, I believe, a splintering of this. So you're going to start to see more amplification, frankly, I think, of these sort of more what could be very difficult messages we don't want to hear. But at the same time, when you put them with a bunch of folks who are then sort of amplifying that message in an ecosystem, an echo chamber, what happens? You by nature think your message or whatever you're sort of saying carries some gravitas. And you sort of create a cycle where, for lack of a better way of putting this, but I think the online piece of that then without any sort of instantaneous check or balance then leads to kind of this equal for equal about, well, someone said this on this platform, it must be true. It's not. They all service different types of communities and different types of hopes and aspirations of the people who use them, even if we don't agree with those hopes and aspirations. And so I think in some ways, those are the types of things that we have to really wrestle with is, if we don't want to deal with those difficult conversations or messages or even ill-informed thoughts, that's one thing. But there's another where that you're specifically dealing with content that's meant to purposefully aggravate, purposely poke at, purposely do those things. And that needs a different type of strategy. Those two are not the same things, but I hear them conflated all the time. Content mills are not the same as people who are sort of really talking about grievances and being aggrieved. Now, we can disagree with the grievance. We can feel like it's not, actually, maybe couched in something that we understand, but there has to be some empathy and compassion for that before we're sort of going to see an amplification of even the worst of sort of some of the things that folks now hold technology as like the most evil of things for. And I think that's partly because we're not doing the work of the longer term, which is how do you address this and how do you get to it? So that I think is for me the biggest takeaway or challenge right now.
Thank you so much, Sabeen, and so critically important too, as we see even more sort of factionalization in the social media space and the different platforms people are using. Shamil, do you want to? I know you reflected on this a lot in your remarks earlier, but if there's anything you want to add before we turn to Nealin and close out.
Yeah, just three things. I think. Thank you. I think this issue of being seen as, or in fact promoting one side of a conflict. I think my perspective on the field as a whole, which has evolved and I think matured a lot over the last few decades, last 4 decades especially, is that oftentimes the practitioner base and the genesis comes from the political left, and that not always, but oftentimes. And I think that you can't. I think it's I think it's impossible, frankly, to engage in adversarial advocacy approaches, campaigns to sanction a regime, campaigns to drive change by naming and shaming a police force or whatever else might be, and also serve a bridge building, peace building role. And that is not a judgment on that campaign approach, but I don't think you can be both of those things at the same time. And I think, as I said, it's really easy to destroy trust. It takes a long time to build it up. In our experience, the police community nexus is one of the most common flashpoints for much deeper systemic and historic problems in any society. Time and time again, you get that flashpoint, but as you dig below the surface, you see that part of it may be systemic and ingrained racism, for instance, within a police force. It may also be a police force that's being asked to make up for and expand a mandate to cover up for many bigger and historic political failings, policy failings. When we engage with police forces and militaries abroad, as an example, when we're able to build sufficient trust that people will speak very openly to us, one of the things you find most often is that not all, but many people in the security sector don't have a whole lot of imagination. Oftentimes, they don't have relationships with the communities that they are supposed to be, engaged with, and their mandates keep expanding. And especially in today's world of social media and conflict spreading the way it is, when they don't have that imagination, they don't have that relationships, and their mandates keep expanding, they tend to retreat to what they do know, which is a top-down repressive approach. That's just one example of a space where a flashpoint erupts, but there's so much more under it. And if you're not able to build that trust and really understand what are the challenges that different communities are dealing with, I think it's really difficult to try to facilitate any kind of cooperative approach that could transform the relationship and address some of the underlying injustices that are there. And so I'll end with, when I look, this was 2 decades ago now almost, I had 2 stints with Search for Common Ground. In my first stint, at one point, I remember bringing all of our country directors together, and we said, okay, we say that we work with every sector of society, and I put 10 different sectors of society up, and I said, put a check mark under all of those that you've had at least 3 years of substantial partnership with. And the 3 areas that had the fewest check marks at that point were armed groups that included state security forces, rebel groups, corporate leadership, the private sector, and religious communities, conservative. Now, these are 3 of the most important communities in most of the settings where we work, and they have a huge impact on conflict. And yet, I would say, because of the sort of political orientation and the comfort level, the cultural comfort level of a lot of our folks at that time, we were doing hardly anything. Now, today, it's just the reverse. We work substantially everywhere we work with, particularly those communities, but you cannot do that if you're trying to hold, both that kind of adversarial advocacy methodology at the same time as you're trying to build trust with the very people that are critical to the conflict. So I think that's the main thing that I would, the main insight that I would share in terms of this issue of peace and justice, and are you being perceived as advocating for one side or the other?
Thank you. I will turn to Nealin to provide a final insight on this question.
I happen to be on a panel with 3 of my favorite people, and so I think they have all covered it very, very well. And I will just maybe end where Shamil started, with this rejection of the dichotomy between peace and justice, the short-term peace and the long-term justice, and say that that peace is meant to be something in service of that justice, and justice makes a sustainable peace possible. And there's an interaction factor back and forth between those 2. And so what I think is critical, though, is that you have these moments of crisis and high tension where it is imperative that you try to address the immediate violence. But the key is that you do that in service of the long term, and that you don't stop, that you bring all of the urgency and passion and importance of that crisis moment into the long-term lifelong, generations-long efforts of justice.
Thank you. So I really want to thank all of our panelists. I think these are such important conversations to be having, and such important themes and tensions to be wrestling with in this work in a long-term way. So I'm so glad that we got to bring in all of your insights into these topics and these tensions, and also some of the concrete areas that you see as being critical in this moment. So thank you so much, and I'll hand it back, I think, to Summer.
Wow. Well, thank you. Thank you, Rachel. That was fantastic. And everybody, and also for my favorite people.